everyone. Welcome back to Dad Space, the podcast for dads by dads. I have Joel on the podcast today. He's going to help us unpack a lot of things that we can use to be better partners, better parents, better men in our community. He's going to share a little bit about his dad's stories, about his father and stuff as well. And again, we're thinking of the dads listening. We're just here to encourage you. And it's Men's Mental Health Month here in June. And Joel's got some things he can definitely bring to the table to help us all. Joel, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy calendar to do this. I appreciate you being here. Yeah,
thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
It's excellent. Joel, tell everybody who haven't met you yet where you are in this big world of ours.
Yeah. So this is our second time talking, different podcast. Kind of serendipitous. We didn't really know that it was going to happen. Double booked by accident, but it worked out. So yeah, I'm a podcaster as well. I have a philosophy podcast from Nowhere to Nothing. I'm a PhD student in psychology. Got a bunch of hobbies, multi-instrumentalist, record producer. I'm a writer. I have a book coming out this fall, a painter. But like everybody else out there listening, I had a dad, right? And so that's sort of the important part of the talk. I myself am not a dad. It's not in the cards for me, and that's something that I'm all right with. But it kind of highlights the complex issue that it is, right? We all have a dad, but our relationships with those dads are very complicated. Our relationships as men, whether or not we're fathers, it all kind of comes back to that relationship in some way.
Yeah. And being Men's Mental Health Month for the month of June, to have these conversations to help men. The beautiful thing about a podcast is people can listen to this and nobody knows what you're listening to. So there could be dads listening to this, pressing play on this. You know, family, friends around you in the room could think you're listening to Ariana Grande right now. But no, we're listening to two guys talk about men's mental health. They kind of like to focus in on the psychology side of all of this and leverage your expertise and your training, your knowledge, because I think that could really help a dad. So I'm thinking in my mind, the psychology of men, the psychology of dads, something. I want to bring out that from our conversation today. As you kind of look back over your studies, what kind of things stand out for you directed towards men who are looking for identity, who are looking for community? I think as I look over my life, I look back at my wedding photos from 30 years ago. The 6 guys that stood with me, I think I could call 2 of them right now. I have their phone numbers. The other 4 would take a lot of work because I don't know where they are. I've lost contact. And those are the top 6 guys in my life in that moment in time. And as I grow older, I notice my circle of friends are shrinking a little bit just due to life. So I'm looking for some insight from you on how to maintain that healthy balance as a man in my relationships and everything. There's a lot of knowledge you have that I'd love to kind of hone in on today and kind of direct our attention that way. So just with that lens, speaking to a dad or a man listening that is kind of struggling for identity and maybe finding those real friendships in life beyond sports and cars and work, like real true friendships and relationships. Kind of give us some thoughts around what you're studying and what you're learning that maybe we can apply to the men listening.
Sure. Yeah. So, I like to give the disclaimer that there's 2 different types of people who get a psychology doctorate. There's, people who are interested in counseling, and helping people work through their problems and interpersonal issues. And then there's research psychologists who look at brain scans and things that are a bit more abstract. And that's the route that I've taken. So as far as providing any sort of, professional advice or anything like that, I'm not the guy for it. But I can say the things that I've seen throughout my studies and some of the research that I've done and things. And what it kind of boils down to is that the psychology of a father isn't something that is highlighted as often even in modern psychology as other groups, other demographics, or even the individual or groups of people as a whole. It's something that's a little bit overlooked, and they're starting to write that. I've seen a few studies come out that talk about various issues. The one that I just saw recently was that men who are fathers have a significantly shorter lifespan than men who are not fathers. And they think that that is largely due. And what's funny about that is that that trend is reversed for women. Women who are mothers live longer than women who aren't mothers. And the later in life you have a child, the longer the mother tends to live. And they don't know the explanation for that, right? Correlation doesn't imply causation, but some of the theories that they have is that, mothers tend to view children as somebody who needs them, right? They need them to be around. And especially if you're a mother who had a child later in life, that means the farther into your later years that the child's going to need you, right? And so that sort of compels mothers to live a little bit longer. Their views on fathers is that men who don't become fathers tend to take better care of themselves. They tend to eat better. They tend to exercise. They tend to be more socially engaged. And men who are fathers, they tend to, they lose time, caring for the kids, right? And they tend to, some of the other things fall by the wayside. And why that is, who knows, right? And it's just a theory, so it might not hold any water when they go to do more research. But I thought that was sort of an interesting thing. But yeah, by and large, right? It's just being a father is something that is a little bit overlooked in modern psychology. Other than there's kind of the psychoanalyst, which goes way back, Freud and Jung and some of these guys, as well as evolutionary psychologists, right? People who look at sort of the phylogeny of the human race and say, okay, due to, evolutionary pressures and the role that men play in social groups, what sort of effect does that have on their psychology? And, there's a lot of things that are sort of intuitive that go along with that, right? Men tend to be competitive. They tend to bond over things that are kind of mission oriented, right? Women tend to value relationships for the relationships themselves, right? And that might explain why a mother lives longer than a father, right? Because the relationship with the child is something that's seen as valuable intrinsically of her itself. Whereas a man, who might see raising a child as a task, something that he wants to see, which I don't mean that in a negative or pejorative way, but in terms of I want to see this child raised successfully. I want to see them become successful. You can see how that sort of viewpoint is much more stressful, right, than just valuing a relationship for itself, right? I want somebody to be successful. I want to see them live to adulthood. I want to provide them the things that they need to survive. That puts a lot of pressure on you as a provider to make sure that those things get done, right? And some of the ways that a child turns out, they're going to turn out that way regardless of who their father or mother were, right? So some of that pressure is undue. But that's just kind of a broad overview of the things I've seen in psychology related to it. But
that's interesting. I love the comparison. It feels like, to expand on that point, it feels like parenting for a dad in general terms is more like a to-do list, and then parenting for a mom is more like a being list, like you are a mother, where you act as a father and do tasks. You actually live it as a mother. It seems to be an interesting dichotomy there when you compare the two.
Yeah, and of course, this isn't to say that there's any difference in men and women or that there's certain gender roles or anything like that. Yeah. Just so much as the male brain and the female brain are different, and so the way that they sort of view certain scenarios tends to be different, right? They've done some studies on this, primarily with mathematics, right? What they found is there's no difference in how good men and women are at math. But when they solve similar math problems, they use completely different parts of their brain, right?
Right.
I think that a similar thing probably happens when you're thinking about relationships, right? Women tend to hone more into emotional aspects and interpersonal aspects and things that tend to be a little bit more grounded in a social sort of sphere, whereas men tend to ground relationships more in things that have less to do with the relationship itself than sort of external goals or things like that.
And that spills over into our relationships with the men in our life. They're our friends or our people that we work with, those relationships that we have. I just feel like, and again, we're talking in generalities here, I understand, but for some of the people I know in my life, friendship kind of comes at the expense of family when you get tied up with responsibilities of life and work and all these things, your relationships. Then your friendships seem to kind of take a back seat over time, where when you're young and single and not in a relationship, just 18, 20, 21 years old, yeah, your calendar's pretty open. You get all this time to do stuff and be with people. And I just think there's a necessity for us to prioritize friendships as we age.
Yeah, and on top of that, even the context of the friendships themselves, right? It's not uncommon for, women to just get together and eat dinner or something, right? But men, again, there tends to be goal-oriented things, right? We're going to get together and we're going to do this thing. We're going to work on a car, or we're going to watch a football game, or we're going to do something together. We're going to hike, right? When I think about me and my friends' relationships, they tend to revolve around activities, right? Mm-hmm. And if you were to put us in a situation that's really familiar to my wife and her friends, right? You'd go, oh, well, this seems kind of awkward or weird because it's sort of emotionally vulnerable, right? Or uncomfortable to just be like, oh, okay, And we've gotten to that point because most of my friends that I know, we've been friends for, over 15 years, right? So eventually you get to that point. But I think that it is harder if you're starting from a point of, especially if you became friends in your teenage years or early 20s, you have this facade of machismo that as you get older, you don't know how to bring it down without, coming across as, less manly, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think we're probably at a disadvantage in the fact that we can't have that kind of relationship to the same degree that maybe the women in our life naturally default to. It's more work for us. We can get there probably. It's just going to be more effort, concentrated effort to have those kind of relationships and friendships that go a little deeper than throwing an axe against a wood wall and cheering, like, well, great, you threw an axe. That's fun. But can we talk about the fact that I feel like I'm totally inadequate at work and I'm really struggling to pay my bills? That doesn't come up in conversation quite often. And I think maybe there's an opportunity there to get to a level with our friendships that we can actually hold each other accountable and have people in our corner. The whole boxing thing, right? The bell goes off between rounds. Who's setting up the stool in the corner for you? And who's that person you go to when life beats you up? You go staggering back to the corner to get refreshed before the next round. Who's in your corner? Who's sitting there with you to pump you up and get you ready? I think we need to really focus on that as men.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that there's I think what you see a lot of men do is I know I've lost friends to this, right? Friends that I had that they got a girlfriend and then you never saw them again, right? And then they eventually got married and they never had any male friends after that, right? And so they look to their girlfriend or their wife to be their sole source of emotional, social support, right? And that's not really healthy. I think that it's, men need man-to-man relationship, but it's definitely difficult for all the reasons that you just mentioned. And especially because, somebody has to give at some point, right? And actually make themselves vulnerable in order for the relationship to become real. And, it's documented throughout history, if not in psychology to the same extent, other than in psychoanalysis, certainly throughout the stories we tell, mythologies and theologies and things. We've been talking about men so far, but we haven't really talked about fathers or dads. But if you look at mythologies, right, every mythology is really centered around the struggle between fathers and sons, right? You look at Zeus and Kronos, or Zeus and his children, and all the way through. And there's the psychoanalyst Jung and Freud, right, interpreted that as this sort of struggle that you see even in nature, right? That is evolutionarily selected for, where fathers, given certain environmental pressures, they'll kill their kids, or they'll kill other fathers' kids. There's this sort of competition right from birth, right? And I think that a lot of us have felt that with our dads, right? Growing up, you as a child, right, before you're even a man, you're exposed to this figure who is a man, right? A full-fledged man. You go, and you're always trying to measure up to that given the male psyche, right? Given the way that both society models things and the way that your brain has just developed over millions of years of evolution. And that's something that I think that a lot of fathers and sons, I know me personally, right, had to work through with their dads. And I think it's the trickiest male to male relationship to navigate in your life.
Yeah. Talk a little bit about your relationship with your dad before we jumped on. You were mentioning just a little bit about him and a little bit about his background and what growing up and kind of the things you've been learning from him. What, as you look back over your relationship and your time with your dad, what kind of things stand out to you, big lessons you learned from him?
Yeah, so my dad was a great guy, but he's very different from me, right? And so that made growing up very difficult, right? I think I mentioned on the last podcast I was on, right? My friends refer to me as the robot, right? Very, very even-keeled, very emotionally neutral, analytical. My dad was the opposite of that, right? He was a very emotional guy. And so, he'd be real happy. He could also get real angry. He was never abusive in any way, never physically or emotionally abusive, but, he did just express his emotions, right? And he was artistic, he was much more of a painter, whereas I do music and some other things. But growing up, he went out of his way to spend time with me, right? We'd go to Letchworth Park in the winter, and we'd pretend that we were fighting imaginary people with sticks. And one time I accidentally bust his lip open with a stick, and he'd always help with sports, right? We'd play baseball. I was a pitcher. One time I threw it, hit him in the toe, knocked his toenail off. So the guy sacrificed a lot, right, to be my dad, right? It was a dangerous job. But yeah, he was a great guy. He had his own business as a sign maker. He eventually became a pastor, right? He was very religiously devout, which is, another way that we sort of differed, right? I'm philosophically minded, kind of open-minded, and he was very religious. He was very emotional. I was a little bit more analytical. And, the teenage years hit, and there's that rite of passage where you're becoming an adult. And, I think he struggled, right? Because my older brother was a bit like him. And so when my older brother got to the teenage years, they would just fight, right? It was just all out fighting because, my brother was doing stuff that my dad didn't like. And so they would fight, but then afterwards things would be hashed out and they'd be good. Whereas, I just never let anybody know what was going on. So I think that, he always had the feeling that I was up to no good because I was a teenage boy. But he lots of times he couldn't prove it, but anytime he could, and he wanted to bring it up, I wouldn't fight about it, right? I'd just clam up. And that kind of put a lot of distance between us, as throughout the teenage years. And that really persisted throughout my 20s as well. But, eventually, I grew up just fine, and we always had a good relationship. It just wasn't very close. And then, I'm the production manager for my company, and eventually, being a pastor, not a lucrative career choice, right? So as congregations have continued to shrink, there came a time where he needed a little extra money. He said, "Hey, I'm looking for a job." And in the back of my head, I'm thinking, man, I don't want to work with my dad, right? Because we have this distant relationship, and if I'm with him for that much time, I know that we're going to be closer than I want. I go, but eventually I said, well, Dad, I got a position that might work for you. And so he came in, and it was great, right? That was the reconciliation, right? When I was finally a full-grown man in my own right, then to have my dad come in, we were able to sort of start from square one, right? And sort of rebuild the relationship and become closer. And, all of those things that I had thought about, all those ways that I'd built up my dad to be this negative character from my childhood and teenage years. As an adult, I looked back and I realized that none of those were him, right? That was just my immature brain sort of making inferences about behavior that he had. Really all along, he had been this great guy. And I just never realized it until I was an adult myself and I could reflect back on it. And, he worked with me for a few years, and then he ended up getting a very rare form of cancer, and he died 3 years ago in November. And I'm so glad for those last couple of years that I had when we could reconcile and become much closer. And I always say that people who say that they have no regrets really haven't reflected enough on life, right? I think we all should have regrets. If you don't have regrets, then you haven't thought deeply enough about your life, or you're not taking it seriously. I regret some of the past that I had with him, but also at the same time, when I look back at it, my whole life and our relationship, I realized that we were very different people, and we always were, and we were always meant to be. And so even once we reconciled, right, those personal differences didn't change, right? It's not like, now Dad and I were hugging and crying on each other's shoulders all the time, right? Because that's not who I am, right? That's not the kind of person I am. But we were able to develop a way of relating to each other and a way of interacting that felt genuine, and that worked for both of us. And so I'm glad it came to that at the end. And looking back over the course of time, I wish we had gotten to it earlier. But at the same time, I knew that, that we were different people, and that was just going to be something that was always going to be hard to work through, right? There was never going to be an easy path forward from the very beginning, just based off of who we were. So I try not to beat myself up over it too much, because, as a psychologist, or as a psychology student, I know this is the kind of thing that could really, kind of haunt you your whole life if you let it. But, and you just have to look at the realities of the situation. But yeah, it's kind of that's the story.
Yeah, that's amazing. How do you think he would think of your life today and where you're heading and your pursuits? You think he would be supportive? You think he'd be in your corner, understanding you better now?
Yeah. It's funny because I sort of, I built myself into being a man kind of hiding everything from him, right? Because I feared this disapproval. But so much of the stuff is public, right? The podcast is out there, the music is out there. And anytime he, whenever he found stuff, he'd always say, yeah, I listened to your podcast the other day, and I'd feel my stomach drop a little bit. And he'd go, yeah, it was really cool, this thing that you were saying. And it's another one of those things that what I was making mention of, right? Like, I remember my dad, being young, and he'd read all kinds of religious texts and things, right? He was an open-minded guy. But I sort of built him up in my head to be this sort of, narrow-minded guy that was going to really put the hammer down on me for any given thing, as a kid or as a teenager. But as an adult, no, he was always very supportive, and he was always telling me how proud he was of the stuff I was doing. So, and I never fully opened up, I never went, and advertised the things I was doing, but I think that he was in on more of it than I even know anyways. But
yeah. Okay. So again, just through your knowledge of your dad and his story, is there anything that we can give to a young dad as far as some ways that we can raise our family, ways that we can interact with our kids so they don't feel maybe some of the things you felt growing up? Is there any kind of lessons you can pull out of that we could help a new dad with?
Yeah, I think that, I think that the lesson is that there's no way you can raise your kid that is going to reliably produce the results that you're looking for, right? Children are unpredictable things. Humans are unpredictable things, right? There's environmental pressures. There's, there's environmental and genetic ways of growing up, right? So my brother, he's my next door neighbor, right? And I have my niece and nephew, and he raised his kids sort of the opposite, the way that my dad did, right? So from a very young age, he was joking with them and but also being really kind of deadpan, straight-laced and things. And he has problems with his kids, right? Where now his kids don't know what's a joke and what's not a joke, right? So, the relationship, right? You're always going to have issues with kids, right? It was never going to be an easy thing. And if you thought it was going in, you might want to think a little bit harder before you had kids, right? So that relationship's always going to be difficult. But I think that the thing that helps the most is, honestly reflecting on who you are as a person, right? And being true to that, and identifying who your child is, right? Because they're half you, but they're half somebody else as well. And depending on what mix they get, right? Me and my brother and sister are as different as can be, right? Between the three of us. So you never know what you're going to get. But if you can identify that early and figure out how those two personalities relate and what somebody needs in order to just sort of nurture those relationships in a way that is honest and genuine and compelling. I think that's the best step to take. And if you get to the point as a man, kind of like we were talking about at the beginning of the show, right? If you've never been able to be vulnerable, right? You've never been able to have a real relationship, you're going to have a really hard time if the first one that you're trying to engage in is with a child, right? Somebody who isn't mature, right? Who doesn't understand all the complexities of the world and your background and things. So, making sure that you're up to that task is a good start. Whether it's developing the relationship with your spouse or significant other, your friends, really starting to understand what that means. That aspect of interacting with other people. I think that's the best starting point.
Yeah, I think the big lesson I learned as my dad went through a cancer journey, we lost him as well. It was the humanity of my dad. I didn't really picture him as a human. He was just this bigger than life man that nothing could stop him. Nothing could take him down. Like he wasn't really human to me. He was just this superhuman for me. And then when you see the real humanity of him going through something that, was really tough for him physically, you really get this sense that, this is a real person, right? He's got fears. He's got, I never thought I'd ever hear my dad say he was afraid. I thought that would just be a word I'd never hear come out of my father's mouth. But to hear him say when he found out that cancer was part of his future, that he was afraid. And I didn't know what to do as a son. I'm like, I don't know what to do with that information. I don't know how to process that. Because you're larger than life. You're the guy who can fix everything. You can, how is this possible that you're human in this moment? And it was like a moment for me to grow up and go, oh, this is just a guy. This is just a guy like me who doesn't have it all together, who's learning as he goes. Again, going back to when I had my firstborn, I didn't know anything about anything, right? I had to figure it all out in the moment. Make a lot of mistakes, but just a human being, right?
Yeah.
So when you look up as a kid, you look up at your parents, you're like, you don't think of them as a human being, that they were a kid one day and they made mistakes and they had to figure this out and they're still trying to figure it out. So I think all of us need to give each other a little bit of grace in the whole process of being a kid or being a dad or a parent or a son. We need to give each other a little bit more grace, maybe, that we're all just trying to figure this out.
Yeah. No, and that's a great point, right? Because what you highlighted is that, even if your dad did everything right, it's still a two-way relationship, right? And that relationship is starting with somebody who, is a child, right? They're not an adult. They won't be an adult for, a quarter of a century or whatever. Yeah. And, you're going to do things that they're not going to understand. You're going to do things that they're going to misinterpret, right? So even if you were a perfect model dad, like I largely consider my dad to be, right? There are still things that I interpreted as being off because I didn't know any better. Yeah. So and that's probably another thing that dads should keep in mind as well, right? Is that it's not always you, right? And but no, it's a really good point. And as children, I think that's something that we've all dealt with, right? None of us think of our parents as really being human. And even once we become adults, right? I think that after a quarter century, right, of growing up and viewing them in this way, it still carries over, right? Even though you might sort of intellectually, abstractly know that your parents are people, there's still this sort of underlying emotional element of denial where it's, until something happens that brings them to that level, you still think of them as this, sort of, ethereal figure rather than a human being.
Yeah. And as my children get older, when they were young, like in their early teens, they thought my wife and I, we don't know anything. We're just, you guys are so dumb. But now the older they get in their 20s, and now my oldest is getting close to 30. He's like, oh, you guys are actually pretty smart. Like, you actually know what you're doing. Like, wow. Like, I kind of didn't give you enough credit when I was younger. You guys are really smart. There's a lot to learn out there. So it's interesting how they develop their opinion of you over time as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So tell us more, Joel, about your podcast, because I'd love to send some people over to you and get some new listeners as well. We chatted about it on the How to Podcast series, but we have a lot of podcast listeners who are looking for their next favorite show. Would love to send the whole audience to you. Talk a little bit more about your podcast and what you do on your show.
Sure. Yeah, so the show is From Nowhere to Nothing. It's a philosophy podcast, right? So some of it is kind of what we're doing here, right? Philosophy is really just the act of taking things that you normally take for granted and then digging below the surface, right? And looking at them a little bit closer. So I like to think that's what we've done today, right? Talking about dads, talking about fathers, all of those aspects of it that you just hear the word your whole life and you're exposed to the person your whole life, and you develop these attitudes and thoughts that you just assume are correct because you've had them for so long. But when you reflect back on them and you look a little bit deeper, you go, oh, wait a minute, it's not everything that I thought it was. So we do this with a wide variety of topics, right? Everything from big things like God and time down to Disney princesses and entertainment franchise reboots, right? We'll take one word or two words. We'll spend a whole hour talking about it. Usually we're looking at formative thought, right? What philosophers have said about this topic throughout history. And then me and my resident expert will sort of talk about it between ourselves, what we think that the topic means. And then the last half of the show, we normally talk about sort of speculative aspects of it, right? Given what philosophers have said throughout history and given, the current cutting edge stuff that we've talked about in the middle, what does it mean for humanity, right? What does it mean for the future and for ourselves? So it's kind of the outline of the show.
Excellent. We can find that everywhere a good podcast are sold.
That's right.
Great. Awesome. Joel, thank you so much for, again, making time in the calendar to talk dad stuff, men stuff, again, with Men's Mental Health Month. Just having some more outside perspective and getting your thoughts on this could really help us to be better partners, better for our kids, better in our community, better to ourselves as well. That's really the key points of Dad Space. So you've over-delivered as always, and I really appreciate you creating a little space for us here on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me on again.
Awesome. Everyone, all the information is always in the show notes as always. And if you want to hear more from Joel, of course you need to, you can hear his podcast, or you can even come over to the How to Podcast series and listen to Joel talk about his show in more depth. Again, Joel, thank you so much for making time for all of us here on Dad Space.
Thanks.
Hey, thanks for listening to Dad Space. Thanks for hanging out to the end of the podcast. That's a great sign to wherever you're listening to this podcast, YouTube, Spotify, Apple, fill in the blank, that this was a good podcast to send people to. So simply by listening to this point of the podcast, you're helping the show grow. So good on you. Thanks for helping us grow Dad Space. If you want to help us fill our cups over at Dad Space, head over to dadspace.ca. Dadspace.ca, simple website, right? Dadspace.ca. You can fill up our coffee cup, which helps us then to keep moving forward with the podcast and use our Buy Me a Coffee link over at dadspace.ca. Thank you for being here. Thank you for supporting the show. Thank you for coming back. And thank you for sharing. Because the more dads we can help, the better. We're all here to help each other grow in community. That's what it's all about. And without you, podcast is pointless. There's no reason to do any of this. So you being here means everything. See you at dadspace.ca. Take care.